Okay, so the title of today's talk is Cleanliness is Next to Blank. One assessment procedure that psychologists have long used is called incomplete sentences or sentence completion. So for instance, a client might be given a list of sentences and be asked to complete them. Examples: what frightens me most is blank. Or, it made me angry whenever my father would blank. Complete that. So the title of today's talk is Cleanliness is Next to Blank. When I gave my title to Mike Ivey, he shared an answer that he'd heard years ago. Cleanliness is next to impossible. I like that title, but there are other ways to complete the sentence, obviously. And we should first grapple cleanliness or purity, because cleanliness is where this begins. There are two very different kinds of motivation that can lie behind the goal of being clean: social presentation and health. So let's look at them in order. If it's social presentation, you take cleanliness seriously in order to look good or smell good, or for your home to look and smell pleasant. If that's what you have in mind, then maybe the sentence would read, cleanliness is next to air freshener, or cleanliness is next to good lawn care, or cleanliness is next to having a good hairdresser, or cleanliness is next to wearing color-coordinated outfits. Each one of us can check and see how we're doing on that today. Then there, excuse me, is cleanliness. That's a matter of health and hygiene. In that case, maybe the sentence would read, cleanliness is next to cooking your chicken thoroughly enough to kill off any Campylobacter, right? There is, of course, a third possibility. It's the metaphorical understanding of cleanliness, where the dirt in question is sin, where you are clean by not sinning or through confession, forgiveness, atonement, whatever. A couple of passages from Psalm 51 tap into this meaning. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. If you grew up as I did, in an evangelical word, you may remember the song, whiter than snow, yes, whiter than snow. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow, right? And there are some New Testament passages as well. One is from the Beatitudes in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, found in the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Another is from the first chapter of John 1. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And near that is another passage. The blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin. In these instances, cleanliness is obviously symbolic and metaphorical, and in the case when the cleansing agent is blood, it's a rather odd metaphor. Water would make more sense, and indeed the sacrament of baptism makes for symbolism that is much less of a stretch. In either case, though, it's a spiritual wash that achieves a spiritual cleanliness. As some of you know, my father was a minister, and he held himself to high standards and urged others to do the same for themselves. He had a little story that he would use in a sermon for that purpose, and the story went as follows. A man is getting dressed, perhaps for a day at the office. He pulls out a slightly rumpled shirt from his closet and holds it up for his wife to see. He says to her, "Honey, is this dirty?" She replies, "If it's doubtful, it's dirty." End of story. If it's doubtful, it's dirty. My dad was using the shirt and ring around the collar, as a metaphor for just about any behavior at all. He was saying, if it's not above reproach, if there's any question about it, don't do it. My dad, aside, whom I loved and respected, I personally do not find the language involving whiteness, spotlessness, freedom from ring around the collar, or whatever, very helpful for three reasons, each of which deserves more time than we have for today. So I'll just mention each of them briefly. The first is the obvious one. Whiteness in our culture can have racist overtones, right? The second is that the cleanliness idiom tends to give undue emphasis in everyday language to sexual transgression. Sure, we do refer to dirty tricks and filthy lucre, but more often it's sex that's associated with the word filth. So for example, if someone speaks of a dirty picture, he's probably describing a picture that is sexually explicit rather than, say, a picture that is a scene of cruelty or violence. My third and last concern about this cleanliness image of sin, if you will, is related to this, and it arises from my own self-examination. I'm a person who has done in my life some things that I'm not proud of. At times I've been irresponsible, inconsiderate, spoken words that cause pain to others, what have you. I also acknowledge that even at age 76, I'm not totally free from dirty old man thoughts. However, it simply does not shed much light on my assortment of personal shortcomings to characterize them as involving a lack of cleanliness. It just seems like the wrong metaphor. Okay. My talk so far in the past few minutes has been a series of tangents and baits and switches, and it's time to get back to the blank in my original title. Cleanliness is next to blank. The most common ending to the sentence is, of course, cleanliness is next to godliness. That aphorism apparently originated, at least within European culture, with John Wesley, the Anglican cleric who was the founder of Methodism. And he was probably thinking of actual physical cleanliness as part of health. Wesley was, in fact, ahead of his time in his concern about sanitation and hygiene. I bet that he was associating cleanliness with godliness, in part as a way of stressing the importance of physical cleanliness, something that was not taken for granted in his time and world. The message was probably something like this: of course you aim to be godly, and all around virtue involves being physically clean too. Keep in mind that the standards of cleanliness were very different in the 18th century when Wesley lived. Few people, probably including Wesley himself, were, even at their cleanest moments, as clean as most of us are routinely, and few of them lived in as clean environments. Why? People didn't have vacuum cleaners, Scotch Guard. Their worlds were not blessed with hot and cold running water or flush toilets, not to mention toilet paper, and so on and so on. My mother, for instance, grew up as part of a reasonably prosperous farm family in central Ohio, Still, the bath water had to be lugged from the well or cistern, which would have served the whole family on Saturday night after having been lugged to the stove, which would have heated it, and then it would have been lugged from the stove to the tub. Traditionally, the youngest was bathed last, hence the expression, don't throw the baby out with the bath water. In my mother's family, I guess there would have been 7 baths on Saturday night from that water. It was the advent of hot and cold running water, combined with Procter & Gamble's 20th century ad campaigns, that led to a dramatic change from my parents' generation to mine, from bathing once a week to showering every day. Changes in hygiene are, of course, among the many factors that have contributed to an increased life expectancy in the 20th century. But as with most good things, there may be a downside. Rates of serious allergies have risen, and one prominent account of the hygiene is what's called the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that asthma, for instance, is a product of growing up in too clean an environment. So all I'll say is that it appears that any praise of cleanliness should probably be accompanied by a question mark or two. So back to godliness, which in John Wesley's aphorism is clearly number one, even ahead of cleanliness. As a descriptive term, godliness is sort of like the word coot. There are no young coots, only old ones. Another such word is spry. Even a graceful ballet dancer who is a triathlete would not typically be described as spry at age 25. It's only an older person. No matter how her faith commitment is, we probably would not describe her as godly either at that age. Godly is more likely to be used as part of a tribute at somebody's 90th birthday party, or perhaps in their eulogy. Or how about this? When reflecting upon his life, an older person utters the following sentence: I was blessed to have grown up around godly men and women. It's probably with reference to those who have gone before that I've most often heard godliness alluded to. So I'll ask you, is your goal to be described as godly during one of your last birthday celebrations, or perhaps in your eulogy? Are you drawn to the notion that your grandchildren or grandnephews and grandnieces will, decades from now, say that they were blessed to grow up around you thanks to your godliness? What would that even mean? How would one pursue that goal? How would being a Unitarian or a Universalist fit in there? For that matter, have you ever heard of a UU church member being described as godly, even in their eulogy? Realistically, saying that a person is godly is a way of saying that their religiousness seems or seemed particularly strong and admirable by one standard or another. It's a way of saying that they are or were a fine human being in a way that has a religious overlay, perhaps involving specific pious activities, frequent church attendance, daily Bible reading, what have you. It might also apply to somebody whose religious involvement is actually a little bit perfunctory, as long as they're wealthy enough and have given a large enough amount of money to some approved religious organization. That might make them godly too, huh? By way of stark contrast, speaking for myself, in the odd event that I were to describe another person as godly, it might not even be a compliment. It might be given while I'm rolling my eyeballs as if to say, oh, godly, as if to say sanctimonious, unctuous, smug, rigid, whatever. There are related terms that we sometimes use in connection with a particular religious group. A good Catholic is a devout Catholic. A good Presbyterian is a staunch Presbyterian. A good Baptist is a big Baptist. A good Unitarian is an, I don't know, maybe an active Unitarian. You tell me. Actually, I understand that the adjective most commonly linked with Catholic these days is no longer devout, it's lapsed, but that's a story for another day. Sometimes in Middle America, rather than calling a person godly, we may say that they are a good Christian, a term potentially applicable to young as well as old. In the 1970s, when Nancy and I were both on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, Nancy did some work with a member of the university's professional staff, a woman who spoke a lot at women's groups and community. Her name was Bert. She was intense, but charming, imposing, but warm, and she easily inspired the respect of people around her. So Nancy and she were at some kind of a training meeting for a woman's service group, and Bert had just been the main speaker. They were in the elevator with some attendees leaving, one of these people in the elevator, was a Texas club lady of a certain age who turned to Bert and gushed, "I can see that you are just such a lovely Christian lady." The ultimate compliment. Bert responded by saying in a suitably warm tone of voice, "Actually, I'm Jewish," which was true. The rest of the elevator, Nancy reported, was marked by silence. Back to godly. As with most any term that has strong overtones or of good or bad, godly can be weaponized in our culture wars, and indeed it has been. Let me share a passage from the Guardian newspaper from March 22 of last year. But first, I should remind you that Roger Stone was one of the convicted felons whom Donald Trump had pardoned by then. So here's the newspaper passage. The night before the January 6th riot, Roger Stone spoke at a Washington, D.C. rally to save America, where the former president's unfounded claims that the election was stolen were pushed, right? And Stone urged at that rally, quote, and I quote, an epic struggle for the future of the country. Struggle between dark and light, between good and evil, between the godly and the godless. So, okay, Roger Stone along with Donald Trump on the side of godliness. What a thought. Back to the real world. The question worth pondering is, how would you like to be remembered? How would I like my eulogy to read? It's a question that is closer to home for me now than it was 50 years ago, I say. In fact, it's exactly 50 years closer to home than it was 50 years ago. But it's actually worth asking at any age. Each day, each of us is tweaking what deserves to be said about us, say 50 years from now in the future. So let's go back to where we started. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Would I want my eulogy to mention my cleanliness? Not really. Not particularly. I wouldn't want my eulogy to mention any lack of cleanliness, but the bottom line is that cleanliness is not likely to be on the table since most of us are usually clean, thanks, as I've said, to indoor plumbing, water heaters, and Procter & Gamble. If my cleanliness were extolled in my eulogy, it would probably be a case of damning with faint praise. And personally, I'd rather be praised with faint damns. But what about godliness? Again, for the record, I do not aspire for anyone to use the word godly at my funeral. But why? Is it because virtue means nothing to me? No. Is it because I don't care whether or not I'm a moral, kind, hardworking, generous person? No, that's not why either. I'd be happy to have any of these descriptions applied to me. Would I mind if somebody described me as ungodly or godless or unchristian? Actually, I'd be a little pissed if they did, but not more so than if they criticized my lack of color coordination. But mainly, I'm uncomfortable with godliness because it's so tied to jumping through the hoops of one another, groups, notions of religious virtue, religious adherence, religious participation, all of which can be distractions, so easily be distractions from the kinds of virtues that are ultimately more important. Virtues that are often enough seen in persons who, when filling out a survey of religious affiliation, check the box that says none of the above, or they might even check the box that says you. It's also the case, of course, that Godliness is too easily subjected to the effects of what we might refer to as air freshener. So as long as we're throwing around the word godliness, let's bring onto the stage a word that is obviously related, goodness. God and good are etymologically and history of language obviously closely connected with one another. So what does the word goodness bring to your mind? Well, there's no question of my mind. What comes to me most quickly when I hear the word goodness, it's the classic line from Mae West in the 1932 movie Night After Night. You know the line. Classic had nothing to do with, I'm sorry, goodness had nothing to do with it. Now, as much as I love the Mae West persona, I have to beg to differ. If what we're talking about is what matters in life, godliness has nothing to do with it, but I'm sure that goodness does. Of course, the admonition to embrace goodness is just a little bit lacking in specifics. I remember the father of a friend when I was a kid, when he was dropping me off at my house after driving us somewhere, maybe when I was 14, rather than saying, bye, Paul, or whatever, he would say, be good. Now, if I'd been in a cheeky mood at the time, I might have turned to him and said, could you narrow that down just a bit? Actually, this particular man was a professor of philosophy, so he might have provided a nuanced expression of the phrase, be good. And I might or might not have appreciated his discourse at age 14. I'm not sure. I hadn't planned for this to be a talk about obituaries or eulogies, though I guess it makes sense that this kind of concern would pop into the mind of someone like me, not particularly because of my age, or not especially because of my age, but because I assume that there's probably no life after death, and thus that at some point, pretty much all that will remain of me is my reputation. However, behaving in such and such a way in order to reap praise at some later point, such as in one's eulogy, is definitely a fool's errand. I'm reminded of the immortal lines of T.S. Eliot. The last act is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. I bungled it, so I'll say it again. I'll say it again. The last act is the greatest reason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. Trying to shore up one's obituary is definitely the wrong reason, almost as misguided as trying to buy your way into heaven by funding the construction of a church or whatever. Anyway, I turn to you now and ask you, if you care to complete the sentence for yourself. Cleanliness is next to blank. Thank you.